Let's look at environmental subsidies. With an environmental tax, you pay a charge for every unit emitted. Subsidies are the double negative of this. First, you do not pay a charge, but you get a premium. And second, this premium is for every unit not emitted. And it's this double negative that makes taxes and subsidies equivalent in the short run. Let's return to the graph we looked at for taxes. The dark brown line is the private gains without taxation, and then the light brown line is the same curve with taxes. And essentially, the tax pushes the private gains down, and that means that your emissions fall from Q prime to Q double prime. And the mechanism is that if you reduce emissions, you pay less tax, and that means that your profits go up, whereas if you increase emissions, you pay more tax, and therefore your profits go down. And that is the incentive for you to reduce your emissions. Now with subsidies, the following happens. If you reduce your emissions, you get more subsidy, and therefore your profits go up, just like it does with a tax. Whereas if you increase your emissions, you get less subsidy, and therefore your profits go down, just like with a tax. And that means that at the margin, a subsidy also pushes down the private gains from emissions, and emissions fall from, if the tax is the same as the subsidy, from Q prime to Q double prime. So in the short run, taxes and subsidies have the same effect on emissions in the short run. And if taxes and subsidies are uniform, then they are necessarily automatically cost effective. We'll talk about that later. But in the short run, taxes and subsidies have the same effect on the environment. In the long run, they have the opposite effect. What matters in the long run is not what happens at the margin, but what happens on average. So we've seen the brown dotted line before, the marginal private gains from emissions, and they correspond to the solid brown line that are the total private gains from emissions. And lo and behold, at the point where your total private gains are optimal is the same point where your marginal gains are zero. Now this is the marginal private gain curve. The corresponding average private gain curve looks like the dotted line that you see here. Now what happens if we introduce an environmental tax? Essentially you're giving money to the exchequer, and that means that there's less money in your pockets, and therefore your private gains fall. With a subsidy, your private gains increase because you get money from the exchequer, and that implies that a tax reduces your profits, reduces your profitability, and therefore it reduces your returns on capital, and therefore capital flees from the polluting sector. With a subsidy, your profits increase, your average profits increase, not your marginal ones, but your average do. Therefore your profitability increases, and therefore new capital flows into the polluting sector. So in the long run, taxes and subsidies have the opposite effect. Taxes shrink the polluting sector, whereas subsidies increase, grow the polluting sectors. And that is an important distinction, and that is why environmental taxes are better for the environment in the long run than environmental subsidies. There's other differences between taxes and subsidies. One is the budgetary implications. A tax shifts money from the polluter to the exchequer, whereas a subsidy shifts money from the exchequer to the polluter. And that has important implications for what you can do with the public sector and all the other nice things that you can do with public money. There's also distributional differences. If you tax a necessary good, food or energy, then necessarily it will hit the poorest hardest, because that is the nature of a necessary good, whereas a subsidy on these things will necessarily benefit the poorest most. So there's also different distributional implications of taxes and subsidies, and that is of course another important distinction that we need to keep in mind.